Now we will going to start working with some of the object-oriented programming concepts pertaining to the idea of overloaded constructors. Now you may have noticed that I've already put out some videos related to overloaded constructors. However, this is a continuation to the similar idea. However, we'll be putting together a different example from scratch and we'll be talking about some of the concepts. To start the process, let me right click on source, go to new, and then create a class. And I'm going to call this class employee class. And this class we're going to have a public static void main of its own. And we will going to now click the finish. And we're going to structure our class just a little different here. And this is where I have my class. Anyway, so now I will be creating in this employee class properties. Or to be more particular, non-static. That means in order to work with these properties, since I will be creating them as private, they can't be seen from outside, so I may have to write public non-static functions or methods to access these properties. And then to actually use those functions, I will be instantiating instance of the employee class. Well, to start out simple, I'll create just one property, private integer emp id. So this is a private non-static class property. To allow me to change the value of this property, I may have to declare a non-static public void setter, which will going to receive an integer value, and we're going to assign that integer value to emp id. Similarly, I will going to create a getter, which will going to simply just return the employee ID. As we have seen in the earlier tutorials, this is just a setter and a getter combination. We have also seen in the earlier tutorials that when you're working with constructors, the constructor's main job is to initialize the properties of an instance, allocate memory for the properties of an instance, and allocate memory for an instance. This is a method of a class with some differences, that it has to have the same name as the name of the class. It has parentheses like any other method does. However, it has no return type. It can only be called once per instance of a class. So here is my default constructor. And when you don't write a default constructor, the system writes one for you, as we have heard in the previous tutorials. So I was going to utilize this to initialize the employee ID to a value of 999 period. Okay. Now I will going to go to my main method and simply instantiate an instance of employee class, as we have learned in the previous tutorials how to go about instantiate an instance of a class. I'm going to call this to set my employee ID to a value other than 999 to 100. Now let's do a quick check here. I will call upon this set employee ID. The employee ID by my getter before the setter was called. So I'll say emp1 dot get employee ID. I'm going to do the same thing again. However, this time I'm calling it after the change. So let me add a couple of things here, before and after, so that you can see the difference. Now I will going to execute my program, and right over here you can see that before the changes take place and after the change take place, it has different values. Okay, so after we have made this change, one more thing that I wanted to introduce to you is that in Java you can actually pack multiple instructions on the same line, and Java won't actually complain about it. Like over here you can see I have packed multiple instructions on the same line, and it's not complaining about it, because in Java it is only the null terminator by which it differentiates one instruction from the other. Now the code is not very readable over here as compared to the last one, because I had nice block structures, but if I execute it, no difference in the output, and I could still see the before and after values. So I'm utilizing this concept in this example so that I could pack more stuff on lines as I introduce other set of values. So now let's overload the constructor. So let's say if I overload this constructor and I say, okay, I would now like to have a constructor in which I can literally pass a value, and instead of me having to settle down with 999, I should be able to set up an instance by a value of my choice. Okay, well and good. So now I decide to do is I create another instance of the same class called employee2, emp2 of the employee class, but now I call a constructor which is not the employee constructor, which is the employee constructor but not the default one, and this time I pass a hard-coded value like 100. And now I'm going to just go about running this program. After I put in the system.out statement for emp2, and I'll say, okay, employee ID 2 before, and I'll just add 1 so that I can differentiate between what data is for 1 and what data is for 2. So as I run this program, now you can say, okay, employee ID 100 after the change, and employee ID 2 before 100. Okay, so now let me give it a different value. Let's say I say 145 and run it again. And now you can see the difference that it's employee ID 100, employee ID 2, 145. So they're different values. And we've also learned in the past that employee ID 1 and employee 1 and employee 2 are two different instances of the employee class, and each instance maintains its own memory. So if you give a value to the employee ID property of emp2, it will not going to override the emp ID property of emp1 because they maintain their own memory spaces. So that is why they do not share a space. Giving or changing a property value for one instance doesn't cause any kind of conflict with another instance. So they both tend to exist at the same time in the memory. Okay, so that allowed us to work with that idea. Now, let's say if I would like to create another instance of employee class, but this time what I'm planning on doing is I'm planning on passing a value through a variable instead of me having to put in a value there. So I say, okay, this is my e variable. I need to declare that because it doesn't exist at this point in time. So this is my e var, in which I am basically taking an instance. I'll basically accept a value here. So I need to be taking care of this through a few lines like scanner. So this is my scanner, system.in. And then I will going to write my prompt. Just like what we have learned before. And now I can say in dot next int. Okay, so I just set it up like that. And now I will be passing this e variable as a value in here, and I will be displaying my employee number 3 back. So now let me run this one, and as you can see, it asks me for a value, and I say, okay, 1005, and here you go, I get 1005 back. So we will be building the next few tutorials right from this example by making a few changes here and there so that you can see the progression and how different things are done. Catch you soon in the next one.